Well, hey guys, welcome to the Veteran Outdoorsman channel. I hope you enjoyed the classic firearms rundowns that I've done the last couple of days. And we'll do a few more in the upcoming weeks. But now we're going to start a series on selecting a shotgun. And it's going to go very in depth. Um, and hopefully it'll be useful for those who are seasoned shooters and those who have never fired a shotgun before, and it'll cover all of that, hopefully. But today, what we're going to focus on is picking a gauge. I'm going to go through the available gauges, at least here in the United States, and then give you my opinion on what you should pick as a gauge. From there, we're going to talk about chokes, then we're going to talk about action types, other aspects of a shotgun, and it's going to be done in multiple videos. Picking what gauge you want, to me, is the most important, so we're going to go from there. There are multiple gauges available here in the United States. The largest legal for most hunting and readily available, although still not very available, would be the 10 gauge. Then you have the 12, the 16, the 20, the 28, and the 410. For those of you who aren't familiar with gauge, what gauge means is a ball, a lead ball of that diameter. This is a 12 gauge. A lead ball of this diameter that would just fit inside this shell. It would take 12 of them to equal a pound. So that's gauge. That's how shotguns are measured. Up until the late part of the 19th century, probably the most common shotgun would have been a 10 gauge. You've got to think the days of black powder, the days of shorter shells, 2 and 9/16, 2 and 5/8, 2.5-inch chambers, etc. Black powder, not very efficient, smaller shot charges, so they used larger diameters to have more payload and to reach out further. But going into the latter part of the 19th century, and into the 20th century and well into the 21st, the 12 gauge became the most popular. In the 12 gauge, there are shells available that would more than outdo the old 8 gauge shotguns. So 10 gauge, though at one time a very common, very useful gauge, now unless you hand load or you solely use it for turkeys, waterfowl, things like that, and even with that, a 12 gauge will take care of the majority of it just as well. A 10 gauge is probably not the gun you would want if you're going to hunt birds, small game, things like that. It may be okay for buckshot for deer. It may be just fine for turkey hunting and whatnot, but you can do a lot with a 12 gauge. So we're going to put the 10 gauge to the side. Oh, we're going to name a few others, and we're going to name my two picks for an all-around shotgun, regardless of what you're going to do with the shotgun. I think the two gauges that I pick at the end are going to satisfy your needs. So let's go on to the 16 gauge. We're going to skip around a little bit and we're going to come back to what I think are the best choices. 16 gauge is a good gauge. It has had somewhat of a resurgence in the last 20 years or so. About 25 years ago, Remington started manufacturing the 70 and 16 gauge again. I think they've since stopped with all their bankruptcy issues and whatnot. I don't think it's available, but there's certainly plenty of them out there. I believe the new Browning A5 is available in a Sweet 16 version in 16 gauge, and there are some double barrels and whatnot. It's not a bad gauge. It's only available in 2 3/4 inch, which in a smaller gauge can be a little bit of a disadvantage. but you can get shells up to at least an ounce and a quarter, I believe. An ounce and an eighth is high brass shell is a pretty standard. 1 ounce pretty standard. You can do a lot with a 16 gauge. Great for rabbit and squirrel hunting, upland game hunting. With the right shells would work fine for waterfowl. When using steel shot, you're already limited to smaller um, payloads, so that could be a little bit of an issue. But with bismuth or tungsten, it can work just fine. It's not quite as available as a 12 or a 20, and not quite as many guns available. So for me, though I love the 16 gauge and I own a 16 gauge, for an all-around shotgun, especially for a new shooter, I wouldn't recommend the 16 gauge just yet. As a go anywhere, do anything gun, or as a first gun or whatnot, I wouldn't recommend the 16 gauge. So we're going to put that one to the side. Let's look at the 28 gauge. The 28 gauge has payloads similar to a 20 gauge. The standard payload would be 3/4 of an ounce, where a 20 gauge standard payload is 7/8 of an ounce. Just standard low brass field loads, etc. Not that much difference. A 3/4 ounce, 1,200 foot per second load, a pretty hot load, is rather zippy, and when loaded with hard number sixes, is a great load for squirrels and rabbits. I know that from experience. It does fine for quail, doves, etc. Not many slugs available in 28 gauge that I'm aware of. And typically only a 2 3/4 inch gun. Benelli is now chambering a 3-inch version of the 28 gauge, which does give it a little more versatility. I believe it moves it all the way up to like an ounce and an eighth worth of shot, which gets it close to that ounce and a quarter 3-inch 20 gauge, but it's just not quite there. Ammo availability, as a general rule, not quite there, though some guys are going to say, well, during the COVID thing, it was easier to find 28 gauge than it was to find 20 gauge, which is true. Most of the manufacturing went to 12, and 28 gauge stayed on the shelf because not that many people bought them. So if you owned a 28 gauge, you could find them. I've got some little Skeeter adapters where I can shoot 28 gauge, so I was actually able to get some shells for that and shoot them in my 12 gauge. Hang on a second. TV's getting loud. I'm going to turn it down real quick, and I'll be right back. Sorry about that. I hope that didn't bother you too much. Back to 28 gauge. I've actually got some little adapters where I can shoot 28 gauge in my 12 gauge. I do that in single shots, or you can use it in a double barrel and whatnot. But 28 gauge is still kind of a niche caliber. I believe it's a better choice for youth than a 410 because of the long shot strings and pretty sparse payload of a 410 and similar recoil. But it's not available everywhere. Not as many guns available. It's more of an experienced shooter's gauge. So we're going to put that one to the side as well. And now let's mention the 410. Lots of kids started with a 410, myself included, and my daughter. That being said, a 410 is more suited to the experienced or expert shooter. It has very small payloads, standard payloads for 2.5-inch shell. And somebody's going, no, it was 2 3/4. Look at the box. The standard short shell for 410 is 2.5. The 2.5-inch is 1/2 ounce a shot. That's not much. It's just a thimbleful. And then for 3-inch, 11/16 ounce, which is just under 3/4 ounce. Where the low payload for 28 gauge is 3/4 ounce, and the recoils are similar. 410 shells are fairly expensive. Generally available, but not the most available as well. The guns are light, easy to handle, things like that, but it takes a lot more experience and a lot better shot to take game on a regular basis with a 410. There's been all sorts of game killed with 410s, including turkeys, geese, deer, etc. But a 410 is more tailored toward the guy that just wants a challenge. So let's look at what's left. And that would be the 12 gauge, which by far, here in the United States and in most places throughout the world, the most common gauge of shotgun. This being a 3-inch turkey load, but 12 gauge. And then your 20 gauge. Typically, the 20 gauge shells are yellow to denote what they are, and that reason being because a 20 gauge will fit inside the barrel of a 12 gauge, and a 12 gauge shell will sometimes chamber behind it. Imagine firing this with this on top of it. Most of us don't like to turn our nice bird guns into hand grenades, so years ago they started making these yellow to make it easier to tell the difference. Somebody's going to say, well, I've got some that are green or red or whatever, and that may be. As a general rule, these are yellow. As a general rule, but not always, 16 gauges are purple. But I've got some blue ones. I have seen red and green. But I don't know that I've ever bought a 20 gauge shell that wasn't yellow. Federal is always this kind of off brownish yellow, burnt kind of yellow. Remington's usually bright. Winchester's usually a little lighter but bright, etc. Get you a little more centered here. Okay, so let's talk about the 12 gauge. Available in 3 shell lengths: the standard 2 3/4 inch, the 3-inch Magnum, and the 3.5 inch. The 3.5 inch really became popular in the early days of steel shot because steel shot was loaded to standard velocities with more standard payloads, and they were trying to get as many pellets of much larger pellets. Back in those days, we shot goose with T's and F's. BBs and triple Bs would be the smallest, and those were kind of considered a little on the light side. Like if you're decoying geese, they'd be okay. But everybody wanted to be able to put as much shot in the air as possible. 10 gauge reached a real resurgence back then. Be able to put as many pellets in the air as possible with the newer steel shot that just wasn't that great. And then turkey hunters figured out that with 2 1/4 ounces, which was equivalent to a 10 gauge load, 2 1/4 ounces of number 6s or 5s or 4s in a 3.5 inch shell, they could really reach out and thump a turkey. But a lot of things have happened with shells over the years. Wads have gotten better. Powder has gotten better. The consistency of the shot and the shell itself has gotten so much better. Where a 3.5 inch is not really necessary, but if you happen to have one, it can be advantageous for certain things. It could really help you reach out there and touch a goose or a turkey. It could work really well with buckshot, allow you to shoot more pellets if you're in a state where you're allowed to use buckshot, or if you're coyote hunting with buckshot or something like that, or vermin hunting with, say you're shooting number 2s or BBs or something like that, and you're shooting coyotes and trying to reach out further and get more pellets in them. 3.5 inch has its advantage, but not as much advantage today as it used to. A standard 3-inch Magnum with either 1 7/8 or 2 ounces of shot, the standard 3-inch Magnum being 1 7/8, the hotter, higher powered load being a 2 ounce, works just fine. A believe with buckshot you go all the way up to like 15 double-aught pellets, but don't quote me on that. All the way up to 2 ounces of number fours, fives, sixes for turkeys. My experience is 1 7/8 of fives or sixes works just fine for turkeys. And I've shot a number of them with that. But you have that availability, you have that versatility. A 3-inch, if you're shooting steel for waterfowl, 3-inch allows you to get a little more payload, 1.25 ounces, maybe a little bit more. Allows you to get those good high velocities that you want with steel shot in the 1,500 plus feet per second range, which is what it takes to get the energy you need with steel. But it also allows you to shoot some really, really powerful bismuth or tungsten shells that'll really reach out there and touch something. So a 3-inch 12 gauge is very common, very popular for larger stuff, such as deer with buckshot, such as turkeys, such as waterfowl, etc. Some guys maybe even throw them in as a second or third shot when pheasant hunting. And I know that some guys use them for jackrabbits, things like that, just for larger stuff. If I was going to coyote hunt, I'd probably want 3-inch shells if using a shotgun. So there's that. And then you have the 2 3/4 inch, the standard shell. All the way from 1 5/8 ounce shot for a 2 3/4 inch Magnum turkey shell down to 7/8 ounce shot for a light such as an international load or a light game load. A lot of variance in there. Makes it very versatile. The 7/8 ounce shells are fine for light target shooting, things like that. They're used for international trap and skeet, traveling very fast. But a standard game load is going to start at an ounce, at 1 ounce of 7.5s, 8s, 6s for rabbits, squirrels, doves, quail, etc. 1 1/8 ounce being what's considered the ideal square load for a 12 gauge, and really popular for all of the claybird classes, sporting clays, trap, skeet. Popular for dove hunting. A lot of the promotional shells, you buy the packs of 4 boxes, it's 1 1/8 ounce, 3 dram, 1,200 foot per second, etc. loads. A fairly fast load, and good for target shooting for dove hunting, etc. The heavy game loads start at 1 1/8 ounce at about 1,200 feet per second, and then move up to 1.25 ounces. There are some 1 3/8 loads available as well. There's a lot of variance, even in just a 2 3/4 inch shell, from 7/8 of an ounce all the way up to 1 5/8 ounce, and basically in 1/8 ounce intervals all the way up. Makes it very, very versatile. The guy well armed with a 12 gauge, whether it be a 2 3/4 inch gun, a 3-inch gun, or 3.5 inch gun. Remember, the 3.5s and the 3s, unless you have a finicky autoloader, will also shoot the 2 3/4 inch shells. The 3.5 inch guns will also shoot the 3-inch shells. So someone's going to say, well, I just get a 3.5 inch and I can shoot everything. And a lot of guys have done that. But if you're never going to shoot a 3.5 inch shell, which you really don't need to, probably better off getting a 3-inch gun. And one of my main guns is a 2 3/4 only. And I do not feel undergunned with that. But it's the most common and probably the most versatile gauge out there. But next, and pretty close, would be the 20 gauge. 20 gauge being available in 3 and 2 3/4 inch. Most modern manufactured 20 gauges are 3-inch, but you can still find some 2 3/4s. I wouldn't recommend getting a 2 3/4 only gun unless you're only going to upland hunt. But when we get into actual gun selection, we'll talk about that. But with a 3 inch, you can turkey hunt. This is an ounce and a half because it's got TSS in it. But a standard 3 inch load is 1 1/4 ounces of lead shot. Fours, fives, or sixes is a general rule. There are some 7 1/2s, and a lot of guys would use those for pheasant hunting. Then there's 2 3/4 inch, which the heaviest of those goes up to 1 1/8 ounces. Not very common. Typically, a high brass 20 gauge shell would be a 1 ounce, 7/8 being the standard. And then there are some light, speedy 3/4 ounce loads available. Again, with 7/8 ounce, dove hunting, quail hunting, squirrels, rabbits, things like that, just fine. Step up to 1 ounce for pheasants, crows, etc. If you're going to turkey hunt, 3 inch shells with 1 1/4 ounces of lead shot will work out to at least 30 yards with the right shell and shell combination out to 40 yards. There is buckshot available. There are a myriad of slugs available. If you have a fully rifled barrel, a 20 gauge with sabot slugs can be much lighter recoiling and much more accurate because of the recoil as a general rule than a 12 gauge and can reach out and take whitetails and feral hogs and things like that with authority. So, to me, my pick is going to be a 20 gauge or a 12. And if I only have one, if I can only pick one, it's going to be a 12 gauge. And I really don't care if it's a 2 3/4 or 3 inch because I don't do that much waterfowl hunting. But if I was a waterfowl hunter, I would pick a 3 inch 12 gauge. But a 3 inch 20 gauge wouldn't fall that far behind. But for waterfowl, larger stuff, I would recommend some of the alternative loads such as bismuth, tungsten, etc. And you can't go wrong. So guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. The next one is going to be on choke selection, and it's going to be a little more in depth. And then we're going to get into action types, what you're going to use your shotgun for, and how to select your shotgun. So, thank you for watching the video. I hope that you would like, subscribe, please share it. Go and check us out on Facebook, a Veteran Outdoorsman page. There is a group that you can join and post pictures and things like that. There's a page I post spur of the moment videos. Try to do that a couple of times a week. There's a lot of stuff to see. And there's also a Veteran Outdoorsman podcast on Spotify. You can check that out. It's been a little while since I posted one of those, but I'm going to try to get that stuff back up as well. Like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Let me know if there's anything else you'd like to see. I've gotten some suggestions already. Thank you very much. God bless you, and we will see you in the next video.